Good morning, wherever you are in Australia. I'm Dante St James. We're going through a little bit of a look or a walkthrough about how Google Analytics 4 differs a bit from Google Analytics Universal Analytics, which is the current version you'll have in your particular website. This is brought to you by the Australian Small Business Advisory Services Digital Solutions Program, presented across Australia by Business Station, specifically by Regional Development Australia, Brisbane in Queensland, and Treaty Business Consulting in the Northern Territory. This will also be available on YouTube pretty much later this afternoon on the Business Station and Dante St James channels. So do check those out if you get a chance as well. I'd love to see you be able to sort of comment below if you are watching this on YouTube right now in the future when this is not live. I do have the chat and the Q&A open. So if you've got some questions around about how this works, please do put that through to me. This will be an introductory look. It's not going to go deep in the depths of setting up your conversions or setting up specific conversion events for you. It's more of a difference between what one platform does and what the other is, and some recommendations on what you should do now that it's out there in the wild. What we're going to look at today is why Google is making this change in the first place. We're going to look at what Google Analytics 4 actually is all about, the main differences between Google Analytics 4 and Google Analytics Universal Analytics, and what's the same as before and what's kind of new, that's something that's very different to what we've had before. And then some recommendations based upon what you should do now. This won't be a long session, so please stay tuned. There's going to be some good info in here, and please, again, ask some questions if you do get a bit stuck. My name is Dante St James. I work with Google's Digital Springboard project across Australia and New Zealand, as well as the Be Connected, Boost with Facebook, Lean Startup Labs, NICE, and ASBAST programs. I've got a very busy calendar, as you can imagine. So why the need for Google Analytics 4? What has come along that's needed to make this so very different? Well, things have changed, specifically on the way that you and your customers are using the internet, particularly the way they're surfing websites and the way they receive them, because we're jumping between devices constantly. There's no easy way for Google to follow this with the current Google Analytics setup. And the way that privacy is going at the moment, so you've got the Firefox browser, Google's own Chrome browser is about to do it, Safari's doing it, Apple's now sort of starting to block tracking of Facebook traffic on its particular platforms on iOS devices. So privacy means that tracking via cookies, which is the way that we usually do it, is pretty much getting harder. There's less information you can get out there from less people, but more so than that, it's actually making it almost impossible to track that way in the future. So within 2, 3, 5 years, the cookie will be long gone. Even if you want to allow for it, there's going to be a lot of laws in place in different countries. Not so much in Australia yet. We are getting there though. But looking at places like California in the US, where you have to disclose that you're doing some sort of tracking. Now, even though this is great for producing ads that are much more relevant to those of us who don't like getting ads for things that are utterly irrelevant to who we are and what we're doing and what our intent is, this does make it harder also for measuring what's going on your website. Because if you say I'm opting out of tracking, then you're telling essentially that the Google Analytics code on someone's website cannot track that you're even there and cannot track what you're kind of doing there. So Google Analytics 4 is a way around this, because we're going to a world with more actions to track, but less ability to be able to track each of those actions on our websites and apps. So a bit of a history of how analytics works. Back in 2005, Google bought a company called Urchin. Now, Urchin was the default analytics and website tracking program that worked in web hosting packages. So if you had a web hosting service back in 2005, I certainly had a few, then you would have known that Urchin was the way that you actually read what was going on your website. It inserted code into your website automatically from the web host, and you were then able to read those things. But when Google bought it, they essentially just made it something which you didn't have to have any sort of like plugged in web hosting to do. You could just apply it to any website at all. So fast forward then to 2012, the Urchin version of Google Analytics was upgraded to include what they called Universal Analytics. So Urchin was always focused more on measuring what a user was doing. So saying, okay, this user did these things. But then the Universal Analytics looked at a much bigger picture. It measured the session or the visit itself, not so much the person. But it did do that anyway. Urchin, it's not the Urchin stuff went away. It just became bigger. So this is adding onto the merchant base of the platform. It was able to measure a lot more about what was going on and things like potential intent of people. So you can measure things like sales funnels, or you could measure some more about the demographics of the visit rather than just that this person came from this country and they visited this page for this amount of time. Then in 2020, we had the rise of Google Analytics 4, or what was called web and app. So web and app, if you saw that in your analytics account, that's what this is. It's essentially taking this web and app part of your Google Analytics, making it the default way that we measure things in Google Analytics. It's a completely new program though, completely new platform. It works in a completely different way, and its measurements are handled very differently to what you would normally get with Google Analytics. And we'll have a look at a bit of how that works. So what is Google Analytics for? It's basically not an upgrade. This is not something you're automatically going to get. It's not like a WordPress upgrade, for instance, where it's been the same base of WordPress going back to day dot, and all that happens is an update comes through and you just press play and off it goes. You don't get this automatically. You have to install it yourself. You have to enable it yourself, and you have to set up an account for Google Analytics 4. It can be under your existing analytics account, but you do have to set up a new property, and it's just measured very differently. Now, some problems you may have with this is that some plugins on WordPress are not quite ready for this because they're asking for UA codes. This doesn't have what is called a UA code, that UA and then about 6 to 7 digits after it. It's got a very new code that's developed, and it's measured a very different way. Now, some that are ready for it, I use the WPMU dev platform to do most of this kind of thing on my WordPress websites. But if you're using things like Yoast, that can be very helpful as well. Or Monster Analytics, Monster Google Analytics, I think it's called, also helps you to set up this kind of thing. So most of the bigger ones are ready for it, but some of those smaller, more custom things, or if you had a website built by someone who did all this for you and inserted the code in, you're probably going to get them to do this for you again. Now, this particular version of Google Analytics, we'll call it GA4 from this point forward, has no relationship to the property that you've got in your current Google Analytics. It's going to sit separately. So in the list of all your properties, you're going to have your website property number 1, and then you're going to have website property number 2 is going to be this Google Analytics 4 version. So they're going to sit parallel side by side because Google Analytics 4 is not quite ready for you to be relying upon all your measurements from just yet. It's still very new, it's still very fresh, but it's one of those things where you should install it now, because the sooner it goes in your site, the more it's going to understand what your traffic is like and what your visitors are like and what they're doing, so it can make better predictions and forecasts about what to do in the future. So continue to use your current Google Analytics, but you can install Google Analytics 4 beside it. It's done through the Google Tag Manager. So you've got your code in there for Google Analytics Standard, and then you can also have code in there for Google Analytics 4. Now, will this slow down your website? It's not going to have a significant effect on your SEO. If anything, having a little bit of extra Google code in there, it's probably just going to give Google more data points, and that may be more helpful for your SEO rather than working against it. So our main differences when it comes to what Google Analytics 4 does is Google Universal Analytics, your standard Google Analytics, relies on what it can see. So you miss out about a lot of things that you can't see right now. So if someone's blocked all tracking from their traffic, from their traveling on your website, if they've got their browser saying, do not track me, then you can't see that stuff. You can't see that they were on your website. You can't see what they did on your website. They are completely invisible to you. So you miss out on a lot of what can't be seen or measured at the time. Google Analytics 4, on the other hand, takes what it can see. So it takes all the things that Universal Analytics can see, but then it adds an algorithmic forecast. So based upon use of your site over a period of time, it's able to forecast and very accurately project how many people were active and did these things on your website based upon patterns of behavior, seasonal patterns, about the way that the users on your website usually behave. So you can see why it's very valuable for you to get this code into your site as soon as possible rather than waiting too long to get it in. The sooner it's in there, the more information it has. Now, the code could sit in your website for the next year and not really add that much value to your experience. You'll still be using Google Universal Analytics. But In 2 years' time, it's had 2 years of stuff going on, all the relationships it has with other websites around the internet. So it's far more capable of being able to say, well, we know that something visited this site based upon the actions of this particular untracked visitor. We can probably extrapolate that it's doing this kind of thing on the website. So it does allow you to track things, I guess, in an algorithmic way. So you're not getting that, yes, we can definitely say for sure that 3 people visited your website today. What will go is, well, I was able to see 2 people, but based upon how your website usually goes, based upon all the patterns we know about the internet and you and everything that's going on around the world, we can say there was probably 3 that were there. So you can rely a bit more heavily on that. Remembering though, this is not a backward step from Universal Analytics. Remember, Universal Analytics can only measure what has been allowed to be tracked. So you're already missing out on knowing that these extra people are coming to your site. GA4 does an algorithmic prediction saying, I know that we can read that there's 2, but chances are that heavily, like there's a 98% chance there's actually 3 that are on there today, not just 2. So it's not a backward step, it's actually a forward step, and your traffic should look better. Another main difference is the Google Universal Analytics platform is a standalone all-in-one that you use for measuring your website traffic alone. And this is usually enough for the average small business owner, unless you're very, very big on your data and you're exporting data out to external platforms to read a lot more into stuff like business intelligence platforms and Power BI or even Google's Data Studio. But Google Analytics 4 is made to be part of a bigger system. So it does do some of the basics on its own, but it's also made to be part of what's called the Google Measurement Suite. And that includes Google Tag Manager, which allows you to put different kinds of Google tags into one tag. So you got one tag on your website, not 5. It also then plugs into itself, Google Analytics 4, and what is called Google Data Studio, which is kind of like the place where you go to build your reports. So how the 2 of them work, if you can imagine, Google's Universal Analytics part of it tracks the page views and the info about them. So it's the thing that's the code in your site that brings in all that information and says, okay, I can see that these people are doing these things on these pages, came from these locations and stayed on for this long and did this. Google's Tag Manager then tracks specific events that go beyond just the basics. So it tracks things like video views, for instance. You can read a video view or a page scroll or a button click or a conversion, much more detailed and much more I guess more complicated stuff, the stuff that isn't just simply a page view and how long that page view stayed there for. And then using the current setup, if you were really quite technical, you'd be using Google's Data Studio to import all the data from both Google's UA or Google Analytics, as well as Google's Tag Manager, combining that all together with all sorts of stuff, maybe from other platforms. You can pull in platforms like LinkedIn and Facebook and other website measurement tools. And then that's what makes sense of all your platforms, all in this one data studio. So it gets all the data. You just throw the round data to say, okay, I want to find out what the who came from Australia, specifically from Melbourne, and how much did they spend. And that's the kind of information you can get out of a combination of all these things. The difference between that and Google Analytics 4 is that Google Tag Manager now is what collects the data. So it's just this one piece of code in the future that will collect all the data. You'll use the Google Analytics 4 interface that stores all the data and does some very basic sort of front-end reporting of, you know, this many people came from this many places and did this many things. And then you can use Google's Data Studio down the track if you want to build much more comprehensive reports. That said, though, Google Analytics 4 has got a great data explorer called the Analysis Hub that allows you to do a lot of this without having to go to Google's Data Studio. So it does represent something of an upgrade when it comes to your ability to explore the data that's there. And I will show you this really, really shortly. This won't be, as I said, a very long session. It's just taking you for a very basic look around that you've got to be ready for in Google Analytics 4 and why it's worth you putting it in. So all this, what does it actually mean to you? The small business owner in Western Australia, Queensland, or the Northern Territory who has a website that they're measuring traffic to, you're still going to see the basics. You're still going to see how many visits there were. You're still going to see where those visits came from and what they viewed and what kind of things they did on your website, a little bit about their demographic info, where that's known, or at least where the algorithm can extrapolate that information. And you're going to see what they used to view you. So what kind of devices, what kind of screen sizes, whether it's mobile, desktop, a tablet, that kind of thing. You'll still see that, remembering too that it's between what they can see and then what they can extrapolate from an algorithmic prediction about what other people were doing as well. So there's lots of different things that they can sort of look at, including, the slowness of page load in your site can also be an indicator not just of a slow web server or a not very well optimized site, but if your site usually runs really fast and then on a particular day it's running a lot slower, that can be a little bit of a story that's telling you, actually, you know what, this page is actually really busy today. That's why it's a little bit slower. So all those pieces of information that it can either get directly or predict, that's what it's putting into this. So that's the basics you're still going to see. An example would be, yesterday I looked into one particular site. My Google Universal Analytics told me that 10 people had been visiting that site in the last 7 days. On this other measurement on my Google Analytics 4, it actually said 11 people had done it. So already it was showing me, because from day one of that particular website, GA4's code's been in there, it was able to already start to see what the patterns of traffic and behavior were and go, you know what, you didn't have 10, you actually had 11. So there's a slightly new layout, and this is what I'm sort of taking a bit of a spin through what it does look like. It doesn't look drastically different, and you can still read and work out what everything is, but it does give you a slightly different layout. So you've got some different things, particularly at views by page screen, showing you what the pages were that people went to. The actual front end does look a little bit more, I think, complete. I'll just run through that again so you can get an idea of what you're looking at. So you've got the standard users there, platform by medium, sessions by session medium. Some of these things are looking at countries, looking at the activity over time, over 7 days there. You can take that out to 28. How people last through different parts of it. So you're still seeing a very, very similar looking layout. It's not like it's a completely different layout, still very, very similar. There is a new section called engagement. So there's a lot more sections you can go into that have filled data. So in the engagement one, you can see what people are actually doing when they're on the site. So the events coming in is not just a page view. What was an actual engagement with that website? What was a scrolling on that website? When the session started, things like who came for their first visit or who clicked on things on your website. So it's actually be able to pick up a lot more actions on the website than just visits. It's now actually able to read things like scrolling. So if you're producing landing pages you've got analytics on, this could be really, really handy for you, because you can actually see if only half of your traffic is scrolling and you've got to scroll to get to the bottom of that page where the call to action is, that may tell you that you need to maybe make your page a lot shorter because people just aren't scrolling to get there, or you have a call to action much, much earlier in it. You can see what the kind of events are. So this is a real close up here, that page view 102, but it shows me that only 46 of those actually scroll on that page. If that for me was a page with a call to action, I'll be a little bit worried about that. I want to see that scrolling a lot higher up if my call to action was way down the page. So there's things that can tell you they're a lot more technical, a lot more specific than what your universal analytics that's now telling you what goes on. So for those of you who are marketers particularly, and those of you who like to measure a lot of what's going on in your website, this is a very, very handy tool that will help you go a long way towards seeing what people are actually doing in your site, like going beyond just things like hotspots, which says, well, this spot no one reads, this spot everyone reads. This tells you the actual actions that are going on each web page. There's this new analysis hub. So have you take a look at this. There's a bunch of templates to use to explore different data within there. So you can do things like figure out, how people behaved on your website as they were coming through. So I can pick up, direct traffic, and I want to see how that compares with, say, a particular event. So it's telling me that, the 14 sessions were direct traffic, and I can then break that down and mix and match all my different data and inputs to get different information. You don't have to take this out of the data studio anymore. You just do it within GA4. Things like acquisition, where your visitors came from, so you can look at where they came from. and then explore this data, not just by going into those preset layouts that were already on the front page, but you can look deeper into each one and compare things. So you can take a comparison between, people coming from Facebook as opposed to people coming from LinkedIn, as opposed to people who are just direct traffic who don't seem to have come from anywhere specifically. So you've got a fair few different things you can use in there. There's funnel analysis, so you can see how people are working their way through your sales funnel. So if you've got a particular page on your website, that's where people usually land when they're coming from an ad, then you can see their process through the funnel. So if you've got 3 different specific places where you go, okay, top of the funnel is landing on this page. If I've got people landing on the next page, but they've also been to my first funnel page and they've come along to the next page that I want them to go to, then they've moved along my funnel. That means you can see specific traffic coming in and dropping out, and you can see where people drop out. So if they're getting to, if you've got 14 stages to your sales funnel, which is pretty complicated, but not unusual. If you've got 14 stages, you see people only getting to stage 3, well, you can see there's something wrong with stage 3. So you can go back and then go, okay, I need to fix that up. Now, some of your regular programs like ClickFunnels, traffic and conversions, some of those funnely kind of programs that you buy that do a lot of this for you, they will give you these same kind of metrics based upon what they can see. But then again, when you've got do not track turned on your browser, and so many people have that today because it's defaulted in things like Safari and Firefox, then what you're going to get is a lack of that information coming through, even through ClickFunnels. They can't measure what they're being told not to measure and what the browser refuses to send. So having this in there, as well as things like ClickFunnels, means that you're able to have that predictive, algorithmically generated prediction about how people are going based upon all the information that Google's able to take for what it can see and for what it knows and understands about human behavior when it goes through sales funnels, going through websites, and going through how people operate when they're on a page. So having that little bit of extra information is going to mean the world to you. You're going to see a whole lot of new stuff open up, so you can make far better decisions about what goes on in your websites and web pages, and not be relying so much on data which is not complete. It's just a snapshot. There's some people saying at the moment that we're only getting around about 60% of the traffic that's coming to our website is actually measurable, and we can actually see that it's there. So it's a very, very unusual world we live in. If you use your web hosts traffic, if you use things like Cloudflare, you'll see very, very different figures coming in than what you see on your Google Analytics as well. On my Cloudflare setup, which is kind of like something that sits between my website and the user, I can see that 160 people may have come through to that particular website page, but I'm only seeing maybe about 90 of those people who are actually showing up in my Google Analytics. So I can go, well, based upon this bit of information, I can see from over there that 160 and there's only 90 here. Then I can say, well, actually, there's 160 people is more likely that came through. You just got to work with something like Google's Google Analytics 4 that looks at that information and then matches it with tons of other data points as well to come up with a more accurate figure, because even Cloudflare is quite flawed and may not measure things quite right. So many options, I know, and it's just probably opened up a few eyes to go, wow, I just thought the traffic was traffic and people were people, and what came up in Google Analytics can be 100% trusted. But unfortunately, that isn't true so much anymore because of the privacy-oriented world we now live in. If you're selling things to people in, say, California, where there's a data privacy law that must be tied down, if you're serving people who are in Europe, where there's a massive GDPR, General Data Protection regulation, those kind of things do have a massive impact on the kind of analytics and results you're getting out of Google. So you can't actually see all that traffic. You can't actually measure what they're doing. And soon this is going to affect things like Facebook as well, as you get more and more browsers such as Safari, everything that runs on a iOS device, like an Apple device, an iPhone, an iPad, those things just will not be able to be measured the same way that you can measure them now. So the idea is to get as much information as you possibly can, get very up to date on what these platforms are doing and how they work, and then make sure you're ready for when the world does come down a bit and not run things the way we're used to. Now you can run both. This is an example of a site that I've got both Google Analytics 4 property and a Google Analytics Universal Analytics running side by side. So now we're seeing the standard Universal Analytics. So this is the one you normally see. So it does look a bit neater and tidier, doesn't it? But that's, the new one's just new. It's got a lot more stuff in it that is a little different. You see there that I've got 10 people were tracked in the last 7 days. I go over to the Google Analytics 4 version and it's telling me there's 11. So it's a little bit different. It's giving me slightly different metrics, slightly different information, but remember, it's combining what it can see with what it's predicting that would have happened as well. Now, this may or may not be particularly accurate at this point of time, but what it's saying is that over a period of time, this will get more accurate. This will get more reliable. At the moment, this is not what you should be making your business decisions and landing page decisions based on. This is just the beginning. So I'll keep saying that again and again. This is not what you need to be relying on. Even Google says that. This is to be run in conjunction with your regular Google Analytics right now. And then in the future, you'll be able to go, okay, eventually you can go, Google Analytics UA doesn't really work anymore because it's just measuring so few people. Now I have to go over to Google Analytics 4 and get a more accurate and far more predictable view of my traffic and what's happening on my website. So very, very different way to look at it. As you can see over on the left, though, a lot of the stuff is still the same. You can still set up conversions. You can still read demographics. You can see the tech, which is basically what people are using to browse your website or browse your property or your app. That's a good point too, is that this measures not just a website or not just an app. It treats them all as the same if that's the way you want to treat it. So if you want to say, I just want to treat all my traffic coming through to all my properties, including my apps, to be equal, that's great. GA4 is really good for that. At the moment in Google Analytics UA, you're treating them as very separate things. So your website is different to your app, is different to another website, whereas you can combine everything all in one. So it's taken a lot of the good stuff that's coming out of Google's Data Studio and combining it into one platform here. So seeing your audiences, then putting in sort of monetary value to certain actions on your website. So you say clicking this button equals $10 worth of revenue. That can be measured under the monetization label here. Retention is all about keeping people engaged on your website or keeping them engaged through the process of your sales funnel. So a lot of those analysis area through the analysis hub is where you'll actually find where you can see that flow and explore it a bit more. So this is the basics, what you see at the front. It's the very, very basics like your standard Google Analytics, but within these side tabs, you find a whole lot more detail, specifically though, in the analysis hub where you can explore each and every little piece of data you've got and make sense of it. So you can compare Australian visitors versus American visitors and see who's worth the most, who stays the longest, who gets further down your sales funnel. That way, with the more data you have laid out in a way that you can understand it, you're able to make better decisions about what you're doing, particularly if you're a very sales-based business, and pretty much all of us are. If you're selling courses online, this is going to really be good for you. Over the next year, this data that's going in there is going to be quite powerful for you. So I would say then what you should do next is move on to set it up on your site. So you can use Google's Tag Manager to install it right now alongside your Universal Analytics. So if you go to Google Analytics, you just go install that. Now I've got a question from Claire saying, how long will it take a web developer to install it on your website? Well, I installed it on a website yesterday. It took me 32 seconds. So if someone's going to charge you an hour's worth of work to set up a Google Analytics 4 account, that might be just because that's their minimum amount of time. This should not take anybody any longer than an hour. If it does, they probably never set up a Google Analytics account anyway. So really, it doesn't take long to do. Once you've got it, go and get used to the interface. You'll see that, like we showed before, that you have both in your Google Analytics, you'll have both the GA4 and the UA version. So you can compare the two, get used to how it works. I would actually invite you to spend a bit more time in your old Google Analytics as well, because if you haven't really explored beyond just that front page, it tells you how many people visited and when, it might be a good chance for you to go a little bit deeper into your data and explore more about what's in there. Things like your conversion metrics, the monetization, how you put a value against a particular action on your website. That sort of stuff is going to help you very, very much when you go across full-time to Google Analytics 4, because it's going to allow you to do all these things. And if you don't understand how they work in the first place in your old analytics, you're not going to get a lot of value out of them in the new analytics. So get used to that interface. Get used to some of those metrics reporting slightly differently, as you saw in just one case that I showed from yesterday when I recorded this, when I recorded the screenshots. those metrics may not match up. They may be a little bit different. In some cases where you got like thousands of people visiting your site per day, and if you do, I'm very jealous. If you do have something like that, you might see some bigger discrepancies. Now, that will settle down over time. In the first couple of months, it's going to look quite different. But as it settles in and the algorithm learns more about what the behavior of your travelers are and your visitors and what they do and where they go, you'll get a much more clear and accurate picture about what's really happening on your website. And eventually, like all these platforms, you'll get rid of the old one and just play with the new one. But let them both run for a year though, at least a year. Google will let you know when the universal analytics has been turned off and sent to bed and sent out to pasture. At the moment though, please do use both, because the longer that GA4 runs, because it's relatively useless now, but the longer it runs, the more useful and accurate it's going to become. So as I said, this is just a very, very brief overview about the differences between Google Analytics 4 and the standard Universal Analytics. I'd like to thank you for joining me this morning. This will be available on YouTube very shortly, both through my own channel, through my name, and through Business Station as well. You can email me, LinkedIn me, Facebook me, whatever you like. I'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, please fire them my way through any of these mediums. So dante@treaty.com.au, LinkedIn, or my Facebook business page as well. Thank you so much again. I've got one of these happening every day this week, including some on Saturdays coming up. So check businessstation.com.au to see what's coming up more. Thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate you spending some time, not just working in your business, but also working on your business. Thank you and have a great week.